Senior Medical Officer Lorkash adjusted his ocular enhancers with a three-fingered hand and squinted at the biological readouts. For the sixth time in 12 minutes. His dorsal spines twitched with irritation, a physical tell he'd never managed to suppress in his 87 years of medical service. Computer, confirm identity scan of subject in Training Bay 4. The AI's smooth response filled his private medical observation pod. Subject confirmed, Cadet Mira Teller. Species human. Planet of origin Earth. Current status. Preparing for Crucible assessment. Lorkash clicked his mandibles together. And they're actually letting her participate. Not a simulation? Affirmative. Full participation approved by Commandant Breltak. Ancestors preserve us, Lorkash muttered, watching the small pink-skinned creature stretching in the preparation chamber. They'll be sending in sessile fungi next. The Galactic Federation Academy represented the pinnacle of achievement for any sentient being with aspirations of space exploration and peacekeeping. For 8,000 years, only the strongest, fastest, and most adaptable species had gained admission. Rexians with their titanium-dense musculature, Kuroxi with their regenerative capabilities, Zolmarians who could process any atmosphere. The standards were legendary. Then humans happened. 3 years ago, the Federation Council had voted by the narrowest margin in history to admit the fledgling species. Political nonsense, obviously. Some diplomatic maneuvering to secure Earth's mineral rights, or something equally tedious. Humans had barely figured out basic interplanetary travel for Void's sake. And now this soft, fragile specimen was about to attempt the Crucible. Lorkash's secondary heart actually skipped a beat at the absurdity. The human Mira finished her preparatory movements and began donning the standard-issue environmental suit. Lorkash noted with professional detachment how the suit engulfed her diminutive frame. No natural armor, no redundant organs, not even decent sensory capabilities, just soft skin, brittle bones, and that ridiculously exposed brain case. Computer, pull up the statistical survival metrics for Cadet Teller. A holographic chart materialized, spinning slowly. At the bottom, highlighted in alarming red, 2% survival probability. At least the computer's being realistic, Lorkash said to no one in particular, settling in to document what would surely be the shortest Crucible attempt in Academy history. He had reports to file after this inevitable failure. The sooner this human washed out, the sooner he could get back to real medical work. Not that he wished her harm, he was a doctor, after all, but some species simply weren't cut out for the rigors of galactic service. Humans, clearly, were one of them. The Crucible wasn't just a training exercise, it was the training exercise. A grueling 12-hour marathon through shifting environmental extremes, tactical challenges, and physical endurance tests that had broken cadets from species 20 times hardier than humans. In its 60-year history, no human had ever completed it. Most hadn't made it past the second hour. Lorkash watched as the assignment roster populated on his screen. As per protocol, the human would be placed on a mixed species team. It was supposedly for maximum educational benefit, but everyone knew it was actually to ensure at least some cadets would complete the course. Team 17, Dravnak Tor, Rexian, Pixis-Olton, Kuroxi, Jethrin Ka, Zolmarian, and Mira Teller, human. Poor bastards, Lorkash said with genuine sympathy for the 3 non-humans. He'd have to note this in their files extenuating circumstances, when their team inevitably underperformed due to their fragile 4th member. The observation screen switched to the pre-mission briefing room where the team was gathering. Drav's massive scaled form dominated the space, his 4 arms crossed in obvious displeasure. Pixis, with her crystalline exoskeleton, kept her distance from the human, light refracting through her body in patterns that any xenopsychologist would recognize as anxiety. Jethrin, at least, seemed merely curious, his gas exchange membranes pulsing with slightly elevated rhythm as he studied Mira. Is this some kind of joke? Drav's translator rendered his rumbling speech into standard galactic. "We're in the advanced track. Why are we saddled with this?" He gestured at Mira with one of his secondary arms. Mira Teller stood a full head shorter than even Jethrin, the smallest of the aliens. Her dark hair was pulled back in what Lorkash had learned was a standard human containment style called a ponytail. She stood with perfect posture, face composed in that unreadable mammalian way that humans had. Cadet Teller qualified for this assessment through standard protocols, the briefing AI announced flatly. Team assignments are final. Pixis made a sound like breaking glass, her species equivalent of a derisive snort. Qualified? How? By breathing successfully for 5 consecutive minutes. Actually, Mira spoke for the first time, her voice carrying surprisingly well for such a small set of vocal organs. "I broke the Academy record on the tactical simulation last week, and I placed second in xenolinguistic aptitude." "Wonderful," Drav growled. "When we need someone to talk to the simulation, you'll be our first choice. For everything else, try not to get killed. It reflects poorly on team leaders when they lose a member." Lorkash found himself leaning forward slightly. Most species would show obvious signs of intimidation faced with a Vrexian's displeasure. The human just blinked. As per regulation, all participants must review their medical pre-assessment before confirming Crucible participation, the AI continued. Holographic readouts appeared before each cadet. Lorkash already knew what they'd show Drav at 89% survival probability, Pixis at 92%, Jethrin at 86%, and the human. Mira stared at the glowing 2% hovering before her. For one brief moment, something flickered across her face. Then, to Lorkash's amazement, she smiled. "Cadet Teller," the AI's voice contained the barest hint of concern. "Do you understand your survival assessment metric? You are not required to participate if—" Mira waved her hand through the hologram. "So what am I supposed to do with the other 98%? The room went silent. Even the AI seemed momentarily speechless. "Excuse me?" Drav finally said. "You heard me," Mira replied, looking directly up at him. "If I've got a 2% chance of survival, that means I've got 98% of something else. Seems like a lot to work with." Pixis's crystalline form actually changed color, a sign of extreme confusion in her species. "That's not how probability works." "Maybe not for you," Mira said with another smile. Lorkash found himself activating the neural pattern scanner, a tool he rarely bothered with during routine assessments. The readings from the human's brain were peculiar. No signs of delusion, no abnormal stress patterns indicating bravado or denial. She genuinely didn't seem concerned by her likely death. Jethrin let out a small puff of methane, his species equivalent of a thoughtful hum. "You are either the bravest or the most foolish being I've ever encountered." "Why not both?" Mira replied, checking the seals on her environmental suit. "Are we going to stand around analyzing my impending doom all day, or are we going to tackle this Crucible thing?" Drav looked like he was about to object further, but the deployment light flashed green. The Crucible was beginning. As the team moved toward the deployment chamber, Lorkash surprised himself by marking Mira Teller's file for special observation. There was something about the human psychological approach that defied standard assessment. Perhaps those diplomatic fools hadn't been entirely wrong to admit the species after all. But he still gave her 20 minutes. 30, tops. The Crucible's first phase hit like a hammer, a sulfuric acid rainfall in a gravity well twice standard. Lorkash watched the environmental readings with clinical detachment as the team deployed into the hellscape. Drav moved with practiced efficiency, his armored plates easily repelling the caustic downpour. Pixis's crystalline form actually thrived in the conditions, the acid temporarily boosting her natural refraction capabilities. Jethrin had activated his atmospheric filtration membranes, a shimmering bubble of processed air surrounding him. And then there was Mira, hunched in her pathetically thin environmental suit, already struggling against the enhanced gravity. Formation Alpha 6, Drav commanded through the team comm. Standard advance protocol. Human, stay in the center where we can see you. My name is Mira, she responded, her vitals showing clear strain but her voice remarkably steady. And I think we should consider Gamma formation instead. Lorkash raised an eyebrow ridge. Gamma formation? That was an advanced tactical pattern usually reserved for asymmetric terrain. The flat acidic wasteland before them hardly qualified. Drav actually laughed, the sound like grinding stones. The human thinks she's a tactician now. The gravity well creates pressure differentials that'll funnel the acid into rivulets within 20 minutes, Mira explained. Gamma formation would position us to use those natural channels for cover. Impossible, Pixis chimed in. You can't predict fluid dynamics that precisely in a controlled environment. Mira shrugged, a very human gesture that Lorkash still found anatomically disturbing. Your call. But where I come from, we study how water behaves on terrain because our lives depend on it. Not all of us evolved with built-in armor. Drav predictably ignored her. Alpha 6, move out. Yep. 18 minutes later, exactly as Mira had predicted, the acid rain began forming concentrated channels that cut through their formation. Drav scrambled to reposition the team, valuable time and energy wasted. Lucky guess, Pixis muttered on the comm. Lorkash noted with interest that the human's heart rate had actually decreased during this exchange. Most species experienced elevated stress when proven right against dominant team members. Humans, apparently, experienced satisfaction instead. The environment shifted again, now a freezing methane blizzard. Jethrin thrived, absorbing ambient gases to boost his energy reserves. The others, including Mira, struggled with visibility and rapidly dropping core temperatures. We need shelter, Drav announced, consulting his navigation interface. Nearest survival station is 2 kilometers north-northwest. Too far, Mira said, her body temperature dropping dangerously. We need something now. Lorkash prepared to log the first team casualty. Human thermoregulation was notoriously inefficient. Yet instead of panicking, Mira began digging into the permafrost. What are you doing? Jethrin asked, genuinely curious. The cold comes from below as well as above. Not if you understand thermal principles, Mira replied, her breathing labored. Help me create a pocket about 1 meter down. The methane snow actually insulates if you get under the surface thermal boundary layer. Pixis made that glass-breaking sound again. This isn't a primitive camping trip, human. The Academy provides emergency shelters at designated, which are 2 kilometers away. Mira cut in, still digging. Look, help me or don't, but I'm not freezing to death to satisfy protocol. Lorkash watched in astonishment as the human created what appeared to be a primitive snow cave. Even more astonishing, it worked. The ambient temperature inside her makeshift shelter stabilized at survivable levels. After a moment's hesitation, Jethrin joined her, followed reluctantly by the others. How did you know this would function? Jethrin asked as they huddled in the cramped space. Humans have been surviving cold environments since before we had fire, Mira explained. We're good at improvising. Improvising isn't in the Academy protocols, Drav growled, though Lorkash noted he seemed perfectly content to benefit from the shelter. Maybe it should be, Mira replied. The next 3 hours continued similarly. Standard Crucible challenges met with increasingly unorthodox solutions. When faced with a radiation zone, Mira suggested using Pixis's crystalline body to refract and split the harmful rays. During the low-oxygen segment, she taught the others how to conserve energy through controlled breathing techniques that Lorkash had assumed were uniquely human, but proved adaptable to other physiologies. Most remarkably, the human's vital signs had stabilized, where other humans had quickly deteriorated during past crucibles. Mira showed signs of a unique biological response. Her endocrine system was pumping out a cocktail of stress hormones that, rather than causing breakdown, seemed to be enhancing her performance. Fascinating, Lorkash murmured, adding another flag to her file. They actually get stronger under pressure. 4 hours in, and the human wasn't just surviving, she was actively contributing. The team's efficiency rating, initially projected to suffer with a human member, had actually improved by 12%. Lorkash found himself, quite against his medical objectivity, rooting for the small pink creature. 6 hours into the Crucible, Lorkash had just begun drafting preliminary notes for a research paper on human stress adaptation when the emergency alert blared through his observation pod. Unscheduled seismic event detected in Crucible Zone 6. Magnitude, severe. Structural integrity compromised. Communication relays offline. Lorkash's spine snapped to attention. Computer. This isn't part of the standard Crucible protocol. Correct. Natural tectonic activity has triggered safety protocols. The extraction teams are being assembled. The observation screens flickered as backup systems engaged. When they stabilized, Lorkash hissed in alarm. The carefully controlled environment had transformed into actual chaos. A massive chasm had split the terrain, sending Team 17 tumbling in different directions. Worse still, the separation had occurred during the magnetic storm phase of the Crucible. All standard communications were down. Show me vital signs, all team members, Lorkash demanded. 4 sets of biometric data appeared. 3 showed elevated stress patterns but stable life functions. The 4th Pyxis flashed with critical warnings. Her crystalline exoskeleton showed multiple fracture points, and her internal fluid pressure was dropping rapidly. The cameras re-established visual. Dreyev had landed on a stable outcropping nearly a kilometer from the others. Jethrin was trapped in a pocket of toxic gas that, while not immediately lethal to his species, effectively immobilized him. And somehow, through either incredible luck or that strange human knack for survival, Mira had ended up on the same ledge as the critically injured Pyxis. Lorkash opened an emergency channel to the Commandant. Sir, we need to abort the exercise immediately. Cadet Ulton requires immediate medical. Negative came the response. Extraction teams estimate 20 minutes minimum for arrival. The magnetic interference is affecting their navigation systems. 20 minutes. Lorkash looked back at Pyxis's vital signs. She had 15, at best. Through the observation feed, he could see Mira kneeling beside her fallen teammate. Pyxis's normally brilliant crystalline form had dulled to an alarming opacity, fracture lines spreading across her surface like a spiderweb. Can you hear me? Mira's voice came through Pyxis's emergency recorder. Yes, system failure. Pyxis managed, her translator glitching. Internal pressure can't maintain structural integrity. Lorkash knew what was happening. Caruxi physiology depended on precise internal pressure to maintain their crystalline matrix. Once compromised, systemic collapse was usually irreversible without specialized medical equipment. Help coming? Pyxis asked, her voice weakening. Mira glanced at her wrist display, which still showed the emergency beacon status. Yes, but not soon enough. She began rummaging through her emergency pack with urgent precision. What are you doing? Pyxis asked. Something incredibly stupid, Mira replied, pulling out her emergency ration heater, water purifier, and medical sealant. But you're not dying on my watch. Lorkash watched in disbelief as the human began constructing some kind of primitive pressure device. Computer, what is she attempting? Unknown. No standard medical protocol matches this approach. Mira worked with startling speed, her hands steady despite the situation. Your physiology maintains internal pressure through microscopic crystalline valves, right? When they're damaged, you can't regulate pressure? Why, yes, Pyxis replied, obviously surprised by the human's knowledge. How did you? I actually read the xenobiology briefings, Mira said, connecting tubes from her water purifier to the ration heater. This is going to feel weird, but it should create enough stable pressure to keep you intact until real help arrives. Lorkash couldn't believe it. The human was attempting an external pressure stabilization using nothing but survival gear, something that required precision medical equipment at any proper facility. The chances of success were infinitesimal. But as he watched Mira's improvised device begin to glow with energy, he realized something remarkable. The 2% survival probability hadn't been for the human at all. It had been for anyone unfortunate enough to be facing dire circumstances with only a human's ridiculous, improbable ingenuity standing between them and certain death. And for the first time in his medical career, Lorkash found himself hoping that this completely unscientific, protocol-breaking madness would actually work. Mira's makeshift pressure regulator hummed with unstable energy as it stabilized Pixis's fracturing form. The crystalline Cadet's color had improved slightly from near-death opacity to merely critical translucence. "This will hold you together for now," Mira said, securing the final connection. "But we need to get you real medical attention and fast." "The others?" Pixis asked weakly. Mira glanced across the newly formed chasm. "Jethran's trapped in a gas pocket over there. I can't see Drav from here." Lorkash watched with professional fascination. The human's improvised medical device was actually working, defying every probability calculation in his system. But they were still facing impossible odds: separated team members, no communications, and an unstable environment that continued to deteriorate. "Computer, extraction team status?" Lorkash demanded. He delayed further. Magnetic storm intensity increasing. New estimated arrival, 32 minutes. Too long. Far too long. On screen, Mira was scanning the unstable terrain with an intensity that reminded Lorkash of predator species analyzing prey movement patterns. Then she did something completely unexpected. She began making noise. Not speech, but a series of rhythmic tapping sounds against the rocky surface beneath her. "What are you doing?" Pixis asked, clearly struggling to remain conscious. "Calling for help," Mira replied, continuing the strange percussion. "Our communicators are down," Pixis reminded her. "I'm not using communicators." Lorkash leaned closer to his screen. The human was producing a complex pattern of vibrations, varying in intensity and duration. His xenobiology training offered no explanation for this behavior. "Computer, analyze the sound patterns the human is creating." After a brief processing delay, pattern matches documented communication methods of indigenous tunnel-dwelling arthropods native to Crucible Training Zone 6. "She's communicating with insects?" Lorkash's mandibles clicked rapidly in disbelief. Within minutes, small purple-shelled creatures began emerging from crevices in the rock face. Each had 6 pincer-like appendages and sensory antennae that vibrated in apparent response to Mira's tapping. "What are those things?" Pixis asked, alarm briefly overriding her pain. "Skitterers," Mira replied calmly, continuing her tapping as more creatures appeared. "They're all through these rock formations. I noticed them during the earlier phases. They communicate through substrate vibrations." "And you can speak their language?" Pixis's voice conveyed her disbelief. "Not exactly," Mira said with a grimace. "But Earth has similar creatures. The patterns are simple: danger, food, help. Universal concepts." The Skitterers formed a living carpet around them now, their antennae waving in synchronized patterns. Mira produced her emergency ration bar, broke off a small piece, and placed it before the largest specimen. The creature examined it, then consumed it rapidly. A frenzy of antenna communication followed. "Bribery," Mira explained to the bewildered Pixis. "Works across the galaxy." To Lorkash's astonishment, the Skitterers began forming chains, linking their bodies together into living bridges that extended across smaller gaps in the fractured terrain. Others began carrying pieces of Mira's remaining ration bars across the chasm in the direction of Jethren's position. "They're going to help us navigate to the others," Mira explained to Pixis. "Their bodies can detect structural stability better than our equipment. If we follow their path, we should be able to reach Jethren, then find Drav." "This isn't in any protocol," Pixis murmured, but there was a new note in her voice, something that sounded remarkably like respect. "Neither is dying," Mira replied pragmatically. She fashioned a harness from her emergency kit and secured Pixis to her back. "This is going to hurt, but it's better than leaving you here." Lorkash couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The human, the physically weakest team member, was now carrying a crystalline lifeform nearly 1.5 times her body weight while traversing unstable terrain guided by primitive arthropods she'd somehow enlisted as allies. "Fascinating," he whispered. The Skitterers led Mira along an improbable path, narrow ledges and near-invisible footholds that no scanning equipment would have detected as viable. Twice, sections collapsed immediately after she passed, suggesting the creatures were somehow communicating real-time structural integrity information. They reached Jethren's position, where the gas pocket had begun to dissipate. The Zomerian was weakened but mobile. "How did you?" he began. "No time," Mira cut him off. "Grab those extra Skitterers and follow me. They'll lead us to Drav." The Skitterers had indeed located the Vrexian, who was trapped on a rapidly eroding outcropping with a leg injury that prevented climbing. When he saw his teammates approaching along an impossible pathway led by indigenous arthropods, his translator couldn't even render his response properly. "The human sent bugs to rescue me?" was the closest approximation. "The human is rescuing all of us," Jethren corrected, helping support Pixis while Mira examined Drav's injury. "Extraction team ATA still 20 minutes, Mira informed them, checking her emergency beacon. "But this whole area is becoming structurally unsound. We need to reach higher ground." As if confirming her assessment, a secondary tremor shook the area. The Skitterers moved with sudden urgency, forming new patterns that Mira observed carefully. "This way," she directed, pointing toward what appeared to be a sheer cliff face. "The Skitterers say there's a stable passage." "You expect me to trust the survival instincts of mindless arthropods?" Drav demanded. Mira looked him directly in his 4 eyes. "I expect you to trust mine." For a long moment, the massive Vrexian stared at the small human. Then, remarkably, he nodded his armored head. Lead on, Cadet Teller. Senior Medical Officer Lorkash found himself in the unusual position of delivering a report to not just the Academy Commandant, but 3 Federation Council representatives who had arrived via emergency transport once news of the Crucible incident spread. "To summarize," Lorkash said, his formal medical tone failing to completely hide his amazement, all 4 cadets survived what should have been, by any reasonable assessment, a catastrophic event. Cadet Ulton's injuries, while severe, were stabilized by what I can only describe as a completely unorthodox field intervention that never should have worked. The holographic display showed footage of Team 17's improbable journey to safety, led by the human and her arthropod guides, arriving at the extraction point just as the remaining terrain collapsed behind them. "And you're certain the Skitterers were actually responding to the humans' communication attempts?" one of the council representatives asked, her tendrils waving with skepticism. "The evidence is conclusive," Lorkash confirmed. "Species we've catalogued as non-sentient tool users somehow formed a symbiotic relationship with the human within minutes of contact. It defies explanation by our current xenobiological standards." The Commandant leaned forward. "Your initial assessment gave Cadet Teller a 2% survival probability." Lorkash's spines flattened in what his species recognized as embarrassment. That calculation followed standard protocols based on physiological capabilities. It failed to account for certain human attributes that appear to function outside our traditional metrics. "Such as?" prompted another council member. adaptability that borders on the absurd, Lorkash admitted. Problem-solving approaches that disregard established procedures yet somehow produce functional results, and a peculiar ability to form cooperative relationships with entirely unrelated species through nothing more sophisticated than pattern recognition and food sharing. The display shifted to the medical bay where Mira Teller sat beside Pixis's recovery pod. The two cadets engaged in animated conversation. Nearby, Drav and Jethrin were demonstrating the Skitterers' communication patterns to an Academy xenobiology team. The Federation's admission standards for humans may require reassessment, the Third Council representative noted. Indeed, agreed the Commandant. Perhaps our traditional emphasis on physiological capabilities has caused us to overlook other valuable traits. Lorkash found himself nodding. If I may offer a medical opinion, continuing to classify humans as a physically inferior species misses the point entirely. He gestured to the footage of Mira carrying Pixis across the unstable terrain. They simply redirect their limitations into solutions we wouldn't consider. As the meeting concluded and the officials filed out, the Commandant paused beside Lorkash. Your personal assessment of humans, Doctor? Off the record. Lorkash's mandibles clicked thoughtfully before he responded with uncharacteristic informality. Give them a 2% chance of survival, and they'll somehow turn the other 98% into a tactical advantage that leaves you wondering who's actually the advanced species, he said dryly. My professional recommendation? Never tell a human something is impossible. The poor fools haven't evolved enough to know when they should fail.